China-U.S. update next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to a special edition of International Focus. Today, we examine the People's Republic of China and its relationship with the United States. We're delighted to have two local experts who are qualified China watchers. Professor Barrett McCormick teaches political science at Marquette University and has conducted extensive research in China and elsewhere in Asia. Professor Douglas Howland holds the David Buck Chair in Asian History at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and has also gained extensive experience in the People's Republic. Gentlemen, welcome to International Focus. Well, thank you for coming on to help us get some insight into a very complex nation and its relationship with the United States. And I want to sort of start by maybe giving a bit of a background for the viewers about where China is today in terms of politically and economically as a backdrop for then the issues that confront the United States and China. So how would you help people understand where the Republic is today?
Well, probably the first thing to remark on is that China now has a history of nearly 25 years of very rapid and fairly consistent economic growth. And the sum total of that is a dramatic change both in the way Chinese society works domestically and in China's role in the wider world. Because of the rapid growth in the Chinese economy, it's a very attractive market to firms all around the world. But it also means that Chinese citizens and different organizations in Chinese society have very different capacities and demands than they did in the past, and it also means that the Chinese state has to learn new roles and new ways to govern China. So it's a very dynamic and not entirely stable situation.
Yeah, I might add to that that China has been internationalizing extensively during the period that Barry just spoke about. In terms of it's getting ready to host the Olympics. It has the new Three Rivers Dam project that's getting investment from the world over, and of course it's getting involved now in the World Trade Association and organization and a great many other international projects and organizations.
People maybe have the stuck-in-time image of communist China. And what you're describing is a much more dynamic, complex place than that.
You know, when I traveled to China as recently as 1990 or 1991, there were places in central China where it took 2 or 3 hours and a trip to a central office to organize an international call. And now when I go to China, it's no harder to call home than it is to call China from here. I mean, just pick up a phone and dial. So it's just a tremendous different level of international openness and modernization, and standard of living, especially in the large coastal cities, changed enormously.
It's still, though, a communist country in the sense that it wants to control very carefully and slowly capitalist development there.
But they have been, that progression, though, has been happening. I mean, it may have been slow, but now we've got, say, 25 years of experience. It has made some major advances.
Oh, yeah, I mean, definitely in terms of construction and investment and the export industries that have risen along the coastal areas. I mean, I'm sure viewers have observed that many of the things that they purchase in American stores now are made in China. Mm-hmm. But no, I was referring more to this interest in, for example, in the crisis a few years back, the desire on the part of the Chinese government not to open currency markets, for example, to the West in order to protect its internal development. So I mean, yes, it's still a communist country in the sense that the Communist Party is still in control, but indeed it has been pursuing this capitalism in a socialist manner, they say.
Yeah, it's a pretty contradictory situation with many elements, particularly of Chinese politics, that have changed not very much over the last 25 years, and then some other things that have changed to an unrecognizable degree. And trying to fit all those contradictory things together is a pretty tough job for the Chinese government.
So the government, in that sense, is maintained. You haven't seen the same openness, perhaps, in the control of the Communist Party on the political situation in China, although we have seen a development in the economic and other spheres. Is that a fair statement?
You could take the internet in China as a classic example that on the one hand the government facilitates investment in the internet and touts itself as a high-tech friendly government, but on the other hand works very hard to censor what people can actually find on the internet, and it's a really difficult game to play.
Help us, maybe if we can first catalog some of the major issues between the United States and China, and we'll have time to dig into them, but give us an overview of what are some of the major issues at play in the U.S.-China relationship.
Some people have characterized the relationship as something like years prior to World War I, where there was an established world order, or say prior to World War II, was an established world order, but rising powers in Germany and Japan, and trying to find some way to adapt the world order to accommodate these rising powers, and some way to adapt the rising powers to not be terribly disruptive in this new world order. China clearly has, or the current Chinese government has some things that they want that are very difficult for the United States to accommodate. On the other hand, China has some things to offer that the United States would really like to have access to or help with. So there's some contradiction, and there's some wonderful opportunity for cooperation.
Yeah, and they've been, the U.S. and Chinese governments have been trying to cooperate, say, on problems with North Korea, geopolitical problems with North Korea, but again, just what, today or yesterday, these stories about the trade issues emerged, as well as Taiwan.
Help us, what are some of the trade issues with the U.S. and China? There's a tremendous amount of trade. It's in the hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yeah, I don't know a precise figure, but indeed, great many electronics goods are coming over from China. Textiles, which is the cause of the current conflict between the U.S. and China.
China has a vast reservoir of very poor people who are willing to work at scandalously low rates. And that, plus increasingly good infrastructure in the coastal areas of China, makes it possible for Chinese to assemble and export many products at prices that are much lower than anybody else in the world can do it. I read of an interview with one factory manager in Southeast China who said, anything you can make for $100, we can make for $25. And that's both wonderful and terrible for Americans. It's wonderful because we get to buy some things at lower prices than they would otherwise be available. It's wonderful because the growth that has stimulated in China creates a wonderful market for many American products. The last news before the imposition of textile quotas was that GM had scored a deal to export a huge amount of automobiles to China, and generally China is the only rapidly growing auto market in the world. On the other hand, many people in the United States believe, rightly or not, that these exports are taking away American jobs and are a threat to their livelihood. So there are wonderful things to cooperate on, and then some areas of fundamental conflict.
Let's take a minute and look at the current dispute. So we have, the U.S. is proposing or has imposed quotas, which means limiting access to U.S. markets for Chinese textiles in this case. What's at stake in that for the U.S.? I mean, what is it that we're trying to protect, and what's at stake in that for China?
I think that the main thing that the Bush administration is trying to protect is the textile industry, which is concentrated, at least to some extent, in the Carolinas, and it's quite frankly a way to win votes from industry leaders and workers in the Carolinas. The Bush administration similarly imposed steel quotas against Europeans to win votes in the steel states, and it's not a new tactic in American politics at all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I read today that something like they imagine that 200,000 jobs have already been lost in the U.S. textile industry, and fear that many more will be because of Chinese imports.
Textiles are a particularly vulnerable sector in the United States. Everybody in the world uses more or less the same manufacturing equipment, and it means that whoever has the cheapest labor produces the cheapest product, and that puts Americans at a terrible disadvantage.
What's interesting, though, is that in the original agreements between China and the United States over trade, it had these built-in preventative or precautionary measures, so that if, in fact, the U.S. felt that Chinese goods would distress a domestic industry, these agreements allowed for the quotas that are in fact being urged to be invoked right now.
So these were things that had been considered in that original agreement as
a matter of principle, not specifically textiles, but as a matter of principle. So it strikes me that these concern about trades and goods flowing to and from countries and the effect that they have on domestic industry was part of the initial thought behind the trade agreements.
What's likely to be the repercussions politically of this disagreement over trade between the U.S. and China? Is it, just going to be another bump along the road of the relationship, or is it really likely to create something of a crisis between the two countries?
Let me say I've heard one report that I will still need to verify, that the Chinese leader Wen Jiabao had been scheduled to come to the United States in the very near future on a buying trip in which he would have bought several $billion, maybe tens of billions of dollars worth of goods. But that's now scrapped, and that would be one of the immediate political repercussions. And what that might mean, for example, is that we trade jobs in Seattle of people who would have been making airplanes, or relatively high-tech, high-skilled labor, for jobs in Carolinas where relatively low-skilled, low-tech workers would have been making textiles. And I think those kind of trade-offs are what's involved in that kind of protectionist policy. China, having the position of one of the most rapidly growing markets in the world, and a very large market, actually does then have a great deal of economic leverage.
Mm-hmm. Is it the kind of thing where but the impacts, this job loss or the impact of buying like that may not be felt for a while, whereas the textile quotas and the jobs, the votes it might generate would be more of a short-term benefit? Are we going to...
Textiles have been a declining industry in the United States for a long time, and the pain that the textile industry as a whole, both investors and workers, feel is very real. There's no question about that. Mm-hmm. It may be more painful to lose textile sales than not to win airplane sales.
Hmm. And the other factor that's often mentioned in these disputes over trade is that consumers will have to pay higher prices for more expensive domestically made goods, mm-hmm. which again figures into the political vote-getting mm-hmm. impulses that Barry mentioned earlier.
The other thing is that if consumers pay a higher price for a toy because it's made someplace else besides China, it may mean paying 10 or 15% more or something like that, and would be relatively unnoticeable, and they're unlikely to vote on that basis, where if someone loses their job, that pain is very concentrated and can be much more easily translated into political pressure in the United States.
We need to take a quick break, and we'll be back in just a moment. And I want to talk more about, you mentioned North Korea and Taiwan as issues that are important in the U.S.-China relationship. We'll be back in just a moment here on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. Gentlemen, I want to pick up with the issue of Taiwan. And there's been some news recently about noises coming out of leadership of Taiwan of sort of objecting to the one China policy and making noises toward you know, it going its own road. And now China saying recently, quite recently, saying there might be repercussions for Taiwan if it pursues that. Can you shed a little light on what is at stake in the China-Taiwan relationship for the United States?
China has, ever since the revolution in 1949, felt very strongly that parts of the former empire that broke away in 1911 ought to remain parts of the Chinese nation state. This is behind their insistence on maintaining control of Tibet, the far western region that's peopled by a great many different ethnic groups, many of whom happen to be Muslim. And then, of course, Taiwan, which in 1949 became the site of the Republic of China that fled the mainland at the end of the Civil War. And while the Nationalist Party has, for up until 2 years ago, maintained control by controlling the political system, it gradually did democratize and open up to the point that now it is a multi-party system with free elections. Mm-hmm. And increasingly some people in Taiwan would like to shed this identity as the Republic of China and become some independent entity, but as you know, the People's Republic and our President Nixon agreed in 1973, there is one China. Mm-hmm. And that's where Taiwan sits between this desire for independence and the sense that there is one China.
The one China policy basically was that we would not recognize a separate entity that would be Taiwan separately from, as a separate country from China, but it leaves, sounds like though it leaves Taiwan in a bit of a limbo of you're not part of China, mainland China, and you're not your own country. So is that, so they're sort of in this...
Indeed, indeed. And it's complicated by the fact that the people who came to the mainland from, who came to Taiwan from the mainland in 1947 are historically of a different linguistic group and imposed their own language on the local people of Taiwanese. So there's a bit of a cultural linguistic difference between the former ruling class in Taiwan and the local Chinese people that have been there for several hundred years. And this too plays into the party alignments in contemporary Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. There's been a serious and long-term cultural trend in Taiwan toward a self-understanding as a Taiwanese people. And there's a fairly solid historical foundation for that. Taiwan's experience of the 20th century is very different than the mainland's experience of the 20th century. To take just one example, Japan's influence in Taiwan is much more benign than it was on the mainland, and the Taiwanese have very different attitudes towards Japan than mainlanders do. Very many bad things have happened in Taiwan when Taiwan's been connected to the mainland. Some of the largest catastrophes in Taiwan have been inflicted by mainlanders. And when Taiwanese citizens today look at the mainland, they're appalled. They see a relatively poor, corrupt, and despotic government and can see no interest in subordinating themselves to that whatsoever. It's almost inconceivable that the people of Taiwan would vote to unify with the mainland. The mainland, on the other hand, has very clearly said that if they should vote to be permanently independent, that they would use armed force. from a point of principles, then, what's at stake for the United States is whether or not armed force can be used to overrule the democratically expressed will of the people of Taiwan. That's a pretty serious question, because the People's Republic does have nuclear weapons that could be used against the United States, so it's a very high stakes conflict.
So it could develop into a very big international dispute, I imagine, between more than just even China and the United States, and it might draw in Japan and others.
Yeah. Yes, it could. And let me say, too, that while the PRC has long had an influence in, or an interest in one China theory, that during the 1990s, and in particular the later 1990s, the current government has pushed Chinese nationalism to the surface and emphasized it far more than some previous governments did. There was a time when the Communist Party's legitimacy was more of an ideological, class-based legitimacy, but now it's almost exclusively a nationalist legitimacy. So they've made this issue a burning issue in domestic politics, and are to some extent now constrained by a pretty fierce nationalism that most Chinese feel pretty deeply. So they have a huge amount riding in terms of domestic politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I suspect, for in the 1980s and 1990s, as the reunification of Hong Kong was enacted, I think a lot of American leaders imagined that that might be a model for the reunification of Taiwan with the mainland.
And this is the example of the one China issue, where you have one China, but you have a system in Hong Kong, perhaps you have a system in, I guess the extension would be you have a different, Taiwan would be a third system, or another system in China. That's the basic theory from the mainland side as to what should happen. And some are saying, you're saying that Hong Kong might be a model for Taiwan.
Yeah.
The bad news is, though, that especially in the last couple of years, things have gone fairly badly in Hong Kong. There's a strong feeling that you can see in public opinion polls in Hong Kong that the government is incompetent, the economy's gone badly, the SARS crisis in Hong Kong was handled badly, and then this summer we had, 500,000 people demonstrating against repressive security laws, and that was a very high percentage of the Hong Kong population that was out. So Hong Kong has become a further warning for the people of Taiwan that even a relatively benign form of unification could have really bad consequences.
Yeah, but interestingly enough, the Chinese government did back off on the,
thank goodness,
on the security law in Hong Kong, and the governor resigned. But we will see if they try to enact this security law in the future.
How do people of Taiwan see the one China, two system model? Is it something that is persuasive to people in Taiwan, or eases their fears if ever there was to be a reintegration with China?
Well, my sense from having lived there and traveling there is that there are still people among this mainland population, perhaps of an older generation, who still feel very strongly that Taiwan is part of China and would support reunification with some sort of precaution. There are an awful lot of people, however, from this, sort of indigenous Taiwanese group, people who left the mainland 300 or 400 years ago, who feel very strongly about a Taiwanese identity and would much prefer to see something like the Republic of Taiwan proclaimed as an independent state, which would then ratify the de facto situation of it existing as an independent state, although they are constrained internationally through the recognition, or in this case the non-recognition of them as a state.
The political parties in Taiwan that have advocated some kind of quicker unification have done very badly in Chinese elections, where they get less than 10% of the vote. I think that the overwhelming public sentiment in Taiwan is a very pragmatic one, that They would love to be independent if they could be, but they understand that actually declaring that would have disastrous consequences, and so they kind of take their lumps and settle for the status quo in a kind of unhappy way, and worried that there may someday be a crisis that would end horribly.
Yeah.
There's almost something of a coming to terms with this middle road of not really being independent and not being part of China, that is better than forcing a crisis, I suppose, at this point. We've got only a couple minutes left, and so I'm interested in any more thoughts on the Taiwan issue, but also want to invite you to give us some comments on North Korea and the relationship between the United States and China, and how the North Korean situation is resolved. Did you have anything, Doug, on Taiwan?
No.
Okay. So what about North Korea? What about the relationship between the United States and China, and how important China is in dealing with the North Korean question?
If the Chinese government had not gotten itself involved in a helpful way, I think it's safe to say that there would have been no negotiations between the Bush administration and the North Korean government, and a very dangerous and volatile situation could well have led to conflict. And it's a case, I think, where the Chinese government has shown its ability to be helpful in international politics.
Yeah, no, they've been, I think the Bush administration has been extremely grateful that the Chinese participated in this.
Even that raises interesting questions, though, in terms of what has the Chinese government gotten for its helpfulness in this. And there's some suggestion, for example, that the Bush people have declared relatively legitimate groups that are working on behalf of the Muslim people in Central Asia terrorists as a way of repaying the Chinese government for its help in North Korea and otherwise in the war on terror.
We'll have to watch this dynamic relationship as it proceeds with the United States and China, textiles, Taiwan, North Korea, and these as other issues as they sort of revolve around each other. I'm sorry that we're basically out of time, but thank you very much for covering a very complex issue and adding a lot of insight and helping people make sense of this. And I encourage our viewers to keep an eye on China and to keep an eye on International Focus, as we'll see you next week.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.